Welcome back to Unboxing OD. I'm Kenneth Pearson, and I'm really glad you're here. This podcast has become more than just a space to share tools or talk theory. It's turned into a conversation. One that stretches across teams, organizations, industries, and roles. And today, we're entering one of the most visible phases of our work in OD, designing interventions. This is the point where ideas become action, where we take what we've learned through assessment, dialogue, diagnosis, and begin to shape experiences that help systems shift, grow, or repair. And here's the thing. A great intervention doesn't just check a box. It connects, it aligns, it resonates. So in today's episode, we'll talk through what makes an intervention effective. We'll explore how to align with strategy, share stories of success from leadership and team building work, stories shared with me by colleagues, clients, and listeners. And we'll get honest about the common pitfalls that trip up even the best of us. And we'll close out by looking at something I believe every OD practitioner should be incorporating: feedback loops that allow the intervention to breathe and evolve. So grab a cup of coffee and let's begin. Before you roll out a single activity, design a single slide, or choose a facilitation method, pause and ask, what is this intervention really in service of? Too often, interventions get designed in a vacuum. They might be thoughtful, well-constructed, even beautifully delivered. But if they're not tethered to the organization's current goals or pain points, they float. And floating initiatives don't stick. I recently had a conversation with a colleague who shared that her team had been asked to lead a resilience training for staff after a challenging fiscal year. But when they asked leadership what they hoped the training would achieve, the answer was vague. We just want people to feel better. So instead of delivering something off the shelf, they began by clarifying strategic priorities. What did resilience mean in this context? What changes were being asked of employees? What supports were already in place? With that understanding, the intervention became more than a workshop. It was a shift of intentional touchpoints tied to organizational readiness, resource planning, and team communication. That shift, from a standalone session to a strategically aligned experience, made all the difference in how it was received. The takeaway? Interventions should never be just reactive. They should be part of a broader arc, aligned to where the organization is trying to go. One listener shared a story recently about a leadership development program they helped design inside a local government agency. Rather than building a generic model, they engaged in a listening process first. They asked, what does leadership look like in this community? What cultural values should be honored and embedded into the work? The intervention became deeply place-based. It included not just competency development, but story circles, mentorship pairings, and opportunities for leaders to reflect on their lineage, not just their role. The program succeeded not because it was comprehensive, but because it was connected. It spoke the language of the system it served. Another colleague recently told me about a team-building initiative that began as a request for a fun offsite, but evolved into something far more meaningful. In early conversations, the facilitator picked up on underlying tensions: unclear roles, poor follow-through, and siloed decision-making. So instead of designing trust falls and icebreakers, they facilitated a realignment process, clarifying team agreements, facilitating honest dialogue, and creating new check-in rhythms that held people accountable and supported. After follow-up and a few additional targeted interventions with integration, 6 months later, the team was functioning more collaboratively and honestly. They were able to surface friction without falling apart. That's the power of team building intervention that meets the moment rather than masking the issue. These stories remind us that effective interventions are rarely flashy. They're grounded, contextual, human. Let's be honest, interventions can go sideways, and sometimes, even with the best intentions, we fall into traps. The first, over-engineering the solution. If the intervention is more complex than the system is trying to support, it becomes exhausting. Simplicity is powerful. Don't underestimate the impact of a clear, focused experience that speaks directly to the people's needs. Another common mistake? Skipping the diagnosis. I've heard from several listeners who've been handed requests like, "Can you run a communication workshop?" or "We need a conflict session," without any assessment of what's really driving the issue. If we don't take the time to understand what's happening beneath the request, we risk addressing symptoms, not root causes. There's also the assumption that one session will solve it all. A single intervention can plant seeds, yes, but real change requires consistency, follow-up, integration. If you're offering something that doesn't fit into a larger strategy or isn't supported by leaders, it will fade. And finally, ignoring the emotional experience of participants. Even the most strategic intervention needs to honor the emotional reality of the people in the room. If you design without empathy, you'll miss the mark, no matter how smart your content is. Feedback isn't the end of the intervention. It's part of the design. A colleague once told me they used to treat post-session surveys as an afterthought. Now, they see them as a goldmine for insight. Feedback loops, when well designed, don't just tell us how people feel. They reveal what was missed, what resonated, and what needs more attention. But feedback isn't just about surveys. It can be built into the experience itself, through reflections, open questions, journaling prompts, peer conversations, or post-session debriefs. One practitioner I spoke to recently embedded a live check-in 30 days after a leadership retreat, not just to review content, but to ask, what's been different since we met? That conversation unearthed barriers they hadn't considered and allowed them to adapt future sessions accordingly. When you build feedback into your intervention, you signal that the work isn't finished when the session ends. You show that you're listening, and that builds trust, not just in the intervention, but in the process of change itself. Designing effective OD interventions isn't about novelty. It's about intentionality. It's about tuning in before acting. It's about seeing the system, not just the symptoms. And it's about recognizing that interventions aren't events. They're inflection points in a longer journey of organizational learning and alignment. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Unboxing OD. At Pearson & Pearson LLC, this approach lives at the center of our consulting practice. Whether we're guiding a leadership cohort, aligning a cross-functional team, or supporting system-wide strategy, our interventions are built to reflect the rhythm, reality, and readiness of the organization. And that philosophy is woven throughout the framework we call the Flow of 5 Tiers, which explores how fundamental values, leadership, people, systems, and outcomes interact and influence one another in real time. The book, The Flow of 5 Tiers, is available wherever books are sold, and it's written for practitioners just like you, those who want to create interventions that not only meet the moment, but shape the future. And now, something I've been really looking forward to. This podcast started as a way to answer the kinds of questions I'd hear often. What does OD really mean? What do OD practitioners actually do? But over time, this has become so much more than that. It's grown into a shared space, a community, and that's entirely because of you, the listener. Your messages, your stories, your curiosity, they have shaped the direction of this podcast. And now, I'd love to invite you even deeper into that space. If you've been listening and thinking, I've got a story worth sharing, a project, a lesson, a perspective on this work, I'd love to hear from you. We're beginning to welcome guests on Unboxing OD, and I'd be honored to explore that with you. You can reach out to me at info@pearsonpearson.llc or connect with me on LinkedIn. The contact information is in the show notes. Let's keep building this conversation together. Until next time, keep designing with care, listening with curiosity, and unboxing what's possible in your workplace. Take care, everyone.